Hi, this is Wade here with IG Labs, and welcome to another episode in our Cyber Podcast series. For today's episode, I thought it'd be cool to go over Splunk's Top 50 Security Threats report. And this report is available to anyone out there, complimentary. All you have to do is just go to Splunk's website. They'll ask you for a little bit of information about yourself, and then in return, you get this nice 106-page document of the top 50 security threats that are out there. And this report is actually really nice the way it's set up. You give you a nice table of contents. So if you are particularly interested in a certain type of security threat, you could go right to that. But I'd advise anyone out there to actually just take a look at this report because it has a lot of great information in there. And they break this report down and make it quite easy to actually look at. And it breaks it down by what you need to know, how the attack happens, and where that attack may or may not come from. But for today's episode, we're not going to go through all 50 of those for the sake of time. But I thought it'd be cool if we actually went through at least 10 of those threats. And so the first threat that we're going to start off with today is the advanced persistent threat. So what is an advanced persistent threat? This is your advanced attack where an authorized user gains access to your systems and they try to avoid detection for purposes such as intelligence gathering or trying to gain that access to your proprietary information. And when you think of APT, you typically think of a nation state actor or a group sponsored by a nation state. And although this attack is sophisticated, the initial access vector is less sophisticated. And throughout today's episode, I kind of want you to just keep in mind the common theme that you hear through some of these different threats in that attack vector. And regarding an advanced persistent threat, that access is usually gained through spear phishing, and again, their goal is to maintain access or that persistence on that compromised network for as long as they can. And an example of an APT would be the 2015 security breach of OPM, and that attack was actually attributed to state-sponsored actors working on behalf of the Chinese government. And what the breach of OPM, the results of that was it compromised over 4 million records of current and former federal government employees, and it revealed information such as family members, foreign contacts, and psychological information. So you could see why a nation-state actor would be interested in that type of information to further their intelligence gathering information operation. The next threat that I would like to mention is a brute force attack, and it's simply kind of pretty much how it sounds. You're taking personal information and just trying to guess usernames and passwords until you're eventually successful. And the very basic brute force attack would be your dictionary attack, where an attacker is just going through a word list. And if you're lazy in today's time, there's automated tools that you can just use to go through that word list for you to do that dictionary attack. And for a brute force attack, it doesn't take much technical experience because people tend to use passwords that are related to like their mother's maiden name, maybe their date of birth, their anniversaries, and things like that. And an example of a brute force attack was back in 2011, and when PlayStation and Sony accounts it was 90,000 PlayStation and Sony accounts that were compromised when hackers used brute force techniques. And that's a lot of accounts for such an attack. The next attack that I'd like to mention and next threat are compromised credentials. And the first thing you may wonder is how are credentials being compromised? And you got to think of it. People are using single-factor authentication. Not everyone's made it over to multi-factor authentication yet. People tend to use the same passwords across multiple systems. And you got to think about it. Once those credentials are compromised on one system, then the next system. And depending on the type of account that's compromised, could be the difference between that adversary having a little bit of access to your stuff or having full out access to databases that contain sensitive information. And these type of attacks adversaries use techniques such as password sniffers, phishing campaigns, and malware. And again, what's scary about this is that once that adversary is on your network using compromised credentials, they're acting as a trusted user on your network. And a good example of a compromised credentials attack was back in 2016. Yahoo experienced an attack, and the breach resulted in 500 million users' personal information. So that's your name, date of birth, phone number, all being leaked. And when you think about it, sometimes when you're out here talking on phones to verify your identity, they're asking for your name, your date of birth, your phone numbers, and then they might also ask you for your address, which that's just another thing that you could get that probably wouldn't be hard to get with as much information that people give out on their social medias and things like that. And this breach also had financial implications for Yahoo because with their sell price dropped by $350 million. So that $350 million was a big bill for them, but also I can't imagine the people whose information was also compromised in that attack. And staying along kind of that similar thread with compromised credentials, next we're going to talk about a credential reuse attack. And again, this just goes back since users tend to have multiple accounts but use the same passwords, or they use the same passwords for those accounts. And you just got to think about if you were a compromised or privileged user and then you were instructed to reset your password. This would do no good if you're just reusing a recycled password. And this more so should be like a policy issue where your security team should have things in effect where it's like, do not reuse passwords and things like that, because even if you identified a breach within your network and you took and rolled your credentials, if you're reusing them, then that adversary can still gain access to your network. And for our coffee lovers out there, in 2019, Dunkin' Donuts experienced a breach as a result of credential reuse. And these threat actors managed to sell those usernames and passwords on the dark web. And this just goes to say that even whether in your professional or personal environment, you should have like the same standard that your professional environment requires when it comes to picking your passwords in your personal life. And that goes with saying that hopefully your company has a great policy in place regarding security and passwords. And the next attack I'd like to mention, or the next threat, is your command and control threat. And this is just simply when hackers take over a system and they can take it over to send commands or malware. And they usually do this to perform reconnaissance, or they can move laterally across your network to get access to that sensitive data. And then attackers can also use that infrastructure to launch the actual attack as well. And again, I want you to think about that access vector is usually through like phishing emails. So that's that common theme that you're starting to see between all these threats, is that access vector. And hackers, they'll use a variety of techniques when it comes to command and control attacks. And they want to keep that, have that ability to log their activities for as long as possible without being detected. And a good example of a command and control attack was the 2015 takedown of Ukraine's power grid. So, in this attack, a worker working at their control center observed his mouse's cursor move across the screen to the digital controls of the circuit breakers and began taking them offline. As a result, approximately 30 substations went down, and about 230,000 Ukrainian residents lost power on a cold night in Ukraine. So good on that person to observe that activity, but that just goes to show that we still have a place and still have to have the awareness to know what's going on and monitoring our systems at all times. The next threat I'd like to mention is a host redirection. And in this, your attackers use URL redirection to gain your trust before they attack. And they use things such as embedded URLs or even phishing tactics to get the user to that malicious site. And this could be as simple as Google having one more O than it should, or your favorite website that you're just so used to going to just slightly slightly being spelt wrong that the average person probably wouldn't notice. And an example that you can think of, or that I can think of now, is like, imagine getting an email from your bank saying to click on that link to validate your information or something like that. And you click on that link without even thinking about it, and you're thinking you're going to a legitimate website, but in reality, you're not, and you're being redirected to another website where you're entering your username and password and giving the adversary those credentials that easy. And an example of this, a greater example of this, would be back in 2017 when Office 365 experienced a widespread phishing attack. And their threat actors, so in this attack, threat actors took advantage of a Google App Engine open redirect vulnerability, sending users to a non-legitimate website where they actually downloaded the malware. And again, that just goes back on us. We got to be observant for these things because they can happen and you won't even realize them at times. And next thing you know, you're owned and your information's out there. And the next thing I'd like to kind of just briefly touch on are IoT threats, just because the IoT world is expanding so much and you have so many smart devices and all different things out there. And it's estimated that by 2030, there'll be 50 billion IoT devices. And the thing with IoT devices, a lot of them, they lack that proper security infrastructure, leaving your network vulnerable. And IoT devices are vulnerable to DDoS attacks, social engineering, and ransomware, to just name a few. But that doesn't mean that it's just those three that apply to IoT attacks. So, and then also, once those attackers gain access, they could have the potential again for that lateral movement to get that greater access if they don't currently have it with that current compromised account. And an example of this was back in 2016, the Mirai botnet brought down the internet for millions of people when they overwhelmed the DIN, which is a US-based internet infrastructure company. And this attack infected IoT devices. And what was unique about this attack is that the botnet had the ability to adapt, which enabled those hackers to develop different variants. And with this attack, it resulted in a DDoS that flooded the servers. And still, just because this will always be a top threat out there, is the insider threat. And so what's scary about the insider threat is this is someone who already has that authorized access to your systems, and they have that malicious intent to take that proprietary or classified information for their personal gain. And the scary thing about this is that, again, they are already authorized users within your network. So it could be that person that's just always, you could never, pretty much an insider threat could blindside you from anywhere. And these people tend to be sometimes recruited by your foreign governments and just people who have ill intent. And then just an example of this, which in 2018, Tesla filed a lawsuit against a former employee saying that the insider allegedly created false user names to make changes to Tesla's manufacturing operating system source code and funneled data outside of the company. As just employees in general, it's our responsibility to be cognizant of these potential insider threats. If you hear things that sound awkward and may trigger something, just keep an eye out and make sure you report that through your appropriate channels. And the reason I wanted to mention insider threat is because there's still that human aspect to these threats. And then along with insider threat, you also have your system misconfiguration. And this can happen because you may have missed a patch, your default accounts, or your poor documentation. You have unnecessary things you don't need, and your default configurations are insecure. And this poses a risk to organizations, and this can happen at any level, And again, this is more so due to human error. And an example of this was a security researcher, Chris Vickery, uncovered a public database containing personal information for approximately 200 million US voters. And this was all because voter information was hosted on an Amazon S3 server and the configurations weren't correct. Some of the data in this was protected, but still a terabyte of voter information was publicly available to anyone on the internet. So we have to be really mindful to make sure our systems are up to date and all that. And last but not least, it's been a hot topic out there and people are starting to pick up on it. It's ransomware. And this is a threat that isn't going to go anywhere anytime soon. And this is simply when your infected host encrypts victim data and holds it hostage until that payment is made, pretty much. And when this happens, that attacker, they'll threaten to leak your sensitive data. And then again, that common theme, ransomware can be deployed through means such as your spear phishing, drive-by downloads, and remote service-based exploitation. And once the malware is on the system, that users typically then you'll get a pop-up, or you might be directed to a website and it'll give you a prompt or something saying your files have been encrypted and you will have to pay X amount of dollars. And according to the cybersecurity company MCSoft, ransomware attacks affected at least 948 government agencies, educational establishments, and healthcare providers in the U.S. in 2019, costing over $7.5 billion. We have natural disasters that we end up giving that much money to aid. So again, these are just 10 of the cyber threats that I thought that I'd mentioned out of this report. And if you have the time, I really advise you to take the time to go back and go to Splunk's website to download this top 50 security threats report and just sift through it for yourself. Today, I just gave you a quick run through of some of the threats. 10. There was no prioritization on those 10. There was just 10 that I thought I'd mention. And every threat should be treated seriously, no matter the threat. And again, thank you for tuning in to today's episode of the podcast. I'm Wade here with IG Labs, and everyone have a great day.